Listen carefully because once you hear this, you'll never look at family, faith, or fate the same way again. In a quiet corner of western Pennsylvania, among moss-covered stones and forgotten names, there stands a row of graves that defies reason itself. 7 identical headstones, lined with mathematical precision, each carved with the same surname, Murphy. And beneath each one rests a son cut down at exactly 21 years of age. Not 20. Not 22. Always 21. For nearly 4 decades, the townspeople whispered of a curse. Mothers kept their children from wandering past the cemetery at night. Priests warned their flocks to pray for deliverance. Yet the deaths continued, one after another, as if carried out by the ticking hands of some unseen clock that waited for the moment of a young man's 21st birthday and then struck with surgical certainty. You see, the tragedy of the Murphy family was not an accident, nor was it supernatural. No shadowy phantom crept into their homes. No biblical curse reached across oceans. What ended those lives was something far colder, more deliberate, and infinitely more disturbing. It was a system, a structure, an arrangement made long before the first Murphy child was born, one that traded freedom for survival and demanded blood in return. The archives of the state of Pennsylvania contain over 300 sealed pages on this family. Pages locked away for over a century, as though the truth itself was too dangerous to confront. But fragments leaked. Letters, diaries, reports written by the only physician who treated 4 of the boys before their deaths, a man who would spend his final days muttering about what he called the Murphy design. Tonight, I will reveal to you what he uncovered and why. But I must warn you, this is not just the story of one doomed family. No, this is a mirror, a reflection of what happens when men submit themselves and their bloodlines to powers greater than themselves. Because in Millfield, Pennsylvania, the company didn't just own the coal. They owned the homes, the schools, the church pews. They even owned the silence that followed each grave dug at 21. And once you understand why the Murphy sons fell one after another, you'll realize curses are never ancient superstitions. They're engineered. The year was 1846. Famine-devastated Ireland was vomiting out its starving sons by the thousands, casting them like driftwood across the Atlantic. Among them was Seamus Murphy, a man older than most of his fellow exiles, hardened by hunger, sharpened by loss. But unlike the ragged, hollow-eyed men who staggered into Philadelphia with nothing but scars and superstition, Seamus arrived with something unusual. He carried a letter. That letter, written in a hand he never revealed, granted him immediate favor with the Keystone Coal and Iron Company, the great industrial power that had carved a town called Millfield out of the Appalachian wilderness. Keystone wasn't merely a company. It was an organism. It owned the streets, the shops, the schools, even the cemetery. A man could be born, live, work, marry, and die in Millfield without ever once touching a piece of land or coin that wasn't controlled by Keystone. Seamus, unlike other Irishmen, was spared the pickaxe and the choking dust of the mines. His mind was his weapon. Numbers, ledgers, contracts. They placed him in the accounting office where he recorded not only wages but debts, tithes, church attendance, even school reports on the workers' children. Every life in Millfield was measured, catalogued, and locked into place. This was not labor management. It was surveillance, a primitive data system, one designed to predict obedience and punish deviation. But privilege came with a hidden price. For when Seamus attempted to buy a modest plot of land to free his family from company housing, the contract they gave him included an unusual clause. Every male child born to him would be bound by future employment agreements, legal chains linking unborn sons to Keystone before their first breath. Seamus signed, as all men signed, believing it was a mere formality. But in that moment, the fate of every Murphy heir was sealed. His wife, Margaret, soon carried their first child. And from the moment of her pregnancy, something strange began. Nightmares plagued her. She saw visions of rows of identical graves, each marked with the Murphy name. She described them with precision, long before the first son would die. The town doctor Ezra Caldwell noted her symptoms carefully. And in his private journals, he wrote a single phrase, "The women know, By spring of 1847, Margaret gave birth to Patrick Murphy, the strong, healthy boy, the first link in a chain of blood contracts waiting to be broken. And when you see how each son fell at 21, you'll realize this wasn't fate. It was arithmetic. By the time Patrick Murphy learned to walk, Millfield had already wrapped invisible chains around him. Every detail of his young life was quietly measured and noted. When he toddled into the company schoolhouse at 6, his teachers weren't just shaping him, they were evaluating him. His handwriting, his obedience, his ability to memorize catechism verses, all of it went into the company's private ledgers. By 10 years old, his future had already been calculated. You must understand, Millfield was no ordinary town. It was a laboratory. Keystone didn't hire men. It selected bloodlines. The settlement program was not just about mining coal. It was about mining people. They targeted Irish Catholic families, battered by famine and exile, easy to control with promises of work and food. But beneath that surface, something darker stirred. Each family became a unit in a controlled experiment to see how far obedience could be engineered across generations. And Patrick, like every Murphy son who would follow, was being prepared for a role he didn't choose. At 16, he was already working in the mine offices alongside his father, surrounded by ledgers thick with coal dust and secrets. He read records that showed not just wages and debts, but notes on which families resisted, who tried to organize, who dared to talk of leaving Millfield. And in the margins, initials codes that marked certain boys for special monitoring. The Murphy name appeared often, but Patrick didn't live long enough to rise above it. On the morning of his 21st birthday, he was found lifeless on the banks of a stream just outside town. No wound, no struggle. A healthy young man gone in an instant. The coroner wrote heart failure. The priest declared it God's mysterious will. The company recorded it as unfortunate. And Millfield moved on. Except Dr. Caldwell didn't. He had been there at Patrick's birth, had watched him grow, had treated his fevers. Now he examined the body. And in his journal, beneath the official report he was forced to sign, he wrote something different. This is not death. This is removal. And here is where the pattern began. When the second Murphy son reached 21, he too was buried. Then the third. Then the fourth. Always on the birthday. Always sudden. Always explained away. Do you see it yet? The Murphy curse wasn't mystical. It was systemic. A precision strike carried out like clockwork, ensuring no Murphy male would ever live long enough to escape the settlement's grip. Because to Keystone, sons were not children. They were property. It is easy, even comforting, to believe the Murphy boys simply died young victims of bad luck, poor health, or divine curse. That is what Millfield's people whispered in the taverns and behind church doors. But luck leaves patterns. Disease leaves symptoms. Fate leaves no signatures. What haunted the Murphys was something else entirely, something human, deliberate, calculated. You see, by the mid-1800s, industrial America had developed a weapon more powerful than any musket or bayonet: control over time. The company owned the clocks in Millfield. They determined when men woke, when children learned, when bells rang for prayer, when shops opened, when wages were dispensed. And buried inside those rhythms, Keystone created its own rituals, predictable cycles of life and death. Every Murphy son was monitored closely in his final year of life. They were given special tasks, new responsibilities, sudden promotions. Then, without fail, the night of their 21st birthday arrived, and by dawn, another grave was dug. One drowned, though he was known as a strong swimmer. Another fell ill overnight, though no sickness had been observed. One was crushed in a mining accident, the only victim, though dozens had been present. Always different in method, always identical in outcome. And every time the priest's sermon was the same. God gives, God takes, accept your place. And every time the company's message was identical. Life is fragile. Work is eternal. Do not resist. But Dr. Caldwell noticed what others ignored. For times he examined the bodies. For times he found details that should not have matched, yet did. A subtle discoloration beneath the nails. A stiffness in the jaw not explained by rigor mortis. Faint burns around the temples, as if touched by some hidden instrument. His notes grew frantic. Not death extraction, something being taken, something being stopped at the threshold of manhood. What was extracted? Not money, not property. It was life potential, the exact moment a man becomes more than a laborer, the moment he might resist, fight, or lead others away. That moment had to be erased. And so, 21 became the ceiling. A design written into contracts, sermons, and graves. A design no one spoke of aloud, but everyone obeyed. Because in Millfield, death was not random. It was scheduled. The Murphy graves were dug by company hands. But the silence that surrounded them, the obedience of a whole community that dared not question, that was crafted in the pulpit. Millfield's Catholic Church stood like a watchtower at the town's center, its bells tolling not just for Mass but for obedience. And the priest who presided over the Murphys' baptisms, weddings, and funerals was no ordinary cleric. Father McKenna had been chosen with the same care Keystone gave to selecting minors. He preached of salvation, yes, but his homilies carried a sharper edge. Every Sunday, the message was clear. Suffering is holy, obedience is divine, questioning authority is rebellion against God. When the first Murphy boy died, McKenna told the town, "The Lord numbers our days before we are born." When the second fell, he intoned, "We cannot escape his design. But here's the truth you must see." McKenna's sermons were not just theology. They were strategy. They conditioned the town to accept what should have sparked outrage. They reframed deliberate removal as divine mystery. They ensured no one would rise, no one would speak, no one would demand answers. And the Murphys themselves? Imagine being a father, Seamus, sitting in the front pew as the priest declared your son's death the will of God, when deep inside you knew it was not heaven but men who held the power. Imagine being Margaret, knowing each pregnancy meant carrying not a child but a contract, a boy destined to dig, to serve, to be erased before he became his own man. And yet, to resist the church was unthinkable. In Millfield, to resist God was to risk exile, starvation, or worse. Dr. Caldwell saw it differently. In his journals, he wrote, "The church here is no longer a shepherd of souls. It is an instrument of the company, sanctifying every grave they order filled." He noticed that McKenna always visited the Murphy house the week before each son's 21st birthday, under the guise of confession or blessing. Afterward, the boy seemed quieter, more resigned, almost as if prepared. You see, belief itself was weaponized. Faith became a cage. And the Murphy sons, bound by contract, by ritual, by sermon, never had a chance to climb out of it. This is the true curse. Not demons, not fate, but institutions that wear the mask of holiness while quietly feeding on obedience. And if you think this story is only about the 1800s, ask yourself, who writes your sermons today? By now, you can see the pattern. But here is where the knife cuts deeper. The Murphy sons were not only killed at 21, they were prepared for it, conditioned for it. Every stage of their upbringing bent toward one truth: you will not live long enough to escape. Think about what that does to a family. Imagine being a boy, growing up under whispers, your mother pale with dread every time your birthday approached. Imagine overhearing the neighbors murmur about the Murphy curse, watching their eyes turn pitying once you turned 20. You would live your childhood in dread, your adolescence in fatalism, and your manhood in a single year of waiting. You wouldn't dream. You wouldn't rebel. You wouldn't build a future. You would accept the design laid upon you. That acceptance was the true goal. Not the death itself, but the psychological control it enforced. Keystone understood something primitive yet profound: that fear could be inherited like blood. When Patrick died, his brothers learned obedience. When the second fell, the third knew resistance was useless. By the time the fifth son turned 21, he didn't even fight. Witnesses described him as eerily calm in his final days, almost serene, as if he had been rehearsing his own funeral since birth. And in truth he had. Dr. Caldwell documented this chilling transformation. His notes describe boys who began strong, defiant, curious, only to become hollow in the months before their 21st year. Not sick, not weak, but resigned. As if the will had been taken out of them, the fight extinguished before the body was removed. He wrote, "The curse is not in the grave, but in the mind. They are dead long before they stop breathing." This was psychological engineering long before the term existed. Ritualized deaths created ritualized fear. The Murphys became living warnings, their headstones serving as milestones for the rest of Millfield. Every worker who passed that cemetery was reminded, resist and your family will pay. And so, the town was ruled not just by coal and contracts, but by symbols. By the image of 7 stones, identical, cold, eternal. A family reduced to statistics. Do you understand? This is how control works. Not through chains, but through belief. Not through brute force, but through repetition until men police themselves, until mothers bury hope before the grave is even dug. The Murphys were not just victims. They were an example. Dr. Ezra Caldwell was not a fool. He was a physician, yes, but also an observer of patterns. And the patterns he saw in Millfield could not be explained by nature. For times he had been called to examine Murphy sons who had died suddenly. For times he had been forced to sign reports that contradicted his own eyes. But in his private journals, the truth was recorded. And what he wrote still chills the blood. In Patrick's case, there was no wound, no struggle, yet Caldwell noted discoloration beneath the fingernails, a faint burning around the temples, almost as though a current had passed through the body. In the second son's case, he observed stiffness in the jaw within minutes of death, something he had only seen in patients exposed to experimental anesthetics. The third was found crushed in a mine accident, but Caldwell recorded that his lungs contained no coal dust, meaning he had died before the rock fell. The fourth, declared a victim of drowning, had water in his clothes but none in his lungs. For sons. For deaths. For explanations that did not match the evidence. And yet the company and the church signed off without question. Caldwell wrote in his notes, "These are not deaths. These are executions hidden in plain sight." But how? How could every Murphy son be removed on schedule, with methods so varied yet so precise? Caldwell began to suspect there was an instrument at work, a tool of science, new and unfamiliar, deployed by those who understood both medicine and fear. His journals described faint puncture marks on one boy's arm, consistent with injections. He theorized that experimental compounds, chloroform derivatives, alkaloids, even controlled doses of electricity were being tested, not just to end lives, but to refine techniques of control. The Murphys, he realized, were subjects. Their curse was a cover story. Their graves were data points. And in the archives, a disturbing link appeared. Keystone Coal had close ties with industrial laboratories in Philadelphia, institutions funded quietly by the same men who ran the mines. They were not only mining coal. They were mining flesh, obedience, and knowledge. Caldwell concluded with a single, damning sentence in his diary. The Murphys are not cursed. They are chosen. And if they were chosen, then someone, somewhere, chose them. Why the Murphys? Why one family, across nearly 40 years, condemned to the same fate? To the townspeople, it was mystery. To the priest, it was God. To the company, it was silence. But to Dr. Caldwell, who dug through records the company thought no one would ever see, the answer was chillingly precise. The settlement program, he discovered, was never random. Keystone Coal recruited families with care, choosing from famine-stricken Ireland, political refugees, displaced farmers. But more importantly, they targeted bloodlines. They wanted stock that was desperate enough to comply, but strong enough to endure. Irish families like the Murphys, bound by faith, tradition, and loyalty, were perfect. Their obedience was cultural. Their silence was generational. Caldwell's journals describe how company records tracked not just wages, but family traits, height, strength, intelligence, temperament. Notes scribbled in margins like a farmer assessing livestock. Patrick Murphy, resilient. His brother Thomas, sharp but quiet. Another, strong build, obedient disposition. Each boy categorized, tagged, filed away. This was not labor recruitment. This was eugenics before the word existed. The Murphys were not cursed, they were selected for study. The pattern of their deaths was not punishment, but data. The timing 21 was no accident. Caldwell wrote, The company tests the breaking point of inheritance. The moment a boy becomes a man, they intervene. And what of Margaret, the mother? Her dreams of identical headstones were not madness. Caldwell suspected she had overheard whispers, caught fragments of truth the town buried. But he also noted her pregnancies were harder than most women's. He speculated, though never proved, that compounds were being introduced to expectant mothers, subtle alterations to see how their sons developed. If true, the Murphy bloodline wasn't just observed. It was manipulated. And this is the hidden cost of obedience. You think you are securing survival for your family. But when you sign the wrong contract, when you kneel before the wrong altar, you are not preserving your children's lives, you are selling them into an experiment you'll never live to understand. That is why the Murphys died. Not because of curses, not because of chance, because their blood had been purchased. And when blood is bought, blood must be spent. Caldwell ended one entry with a warning, a whisper meant for anyone who might read him after. This design will not stop with the Murphys. Once they perfect the method, they will scale it. And that is exactly what they did. The Murphy family was not the only one. That was Dr. Caldwell's most terrifying discovery. He began cross-checking ledgers from other company towns, quietly acquiring burial records, baptism registries, even old miners' union notes. And there it was, the pattern, repeated. Not identical, not always at 21, but disturbingly consistent. Families recruited from famine or upheaval, their sons removed before they could inherit property, before they could form alliances, before they could become leaders. In one town, all the eldest sons died in their first year of marriage. In another, it was soldiers returning from war mysteriously struck down before they could claim pensions. Different faces, different names, but the same rhythm. And the most sinister detail, the deaths always aligned with institutional transitions. The age of inheritance, the moment of independence, the threshold where a man ceases to be dependent on family and begins to forge his own path. That was the point of removal. It wasn't just about stopping one life. It was about ensuring no one lived long enough to challenge the system itself. The Murphys became the most obvious case, the most visible. 7 stones in one row, impossible to ignore. But that visibility was also a strategy. Because when tragedy looks like curse, when horror looks like fate, people stop asking questions. They turn inward. They whisper about superstition instead of conspiracy. They blame God instead of men. Caldwell knew better. He wrote, "The Murphy deaths are not anomaly but template. Controlled burn. A trial run for methods of population control that can be exported far beyond Millfield." And here lies the revelation. The tragedy of the Murphys was not an isolated family curse. It was a prototype, a demonstration of how to govern a people through fear, through ritualized death, through the engineering of despair. A method that could be scaled to towns, to cities, to nations. Tell me, when you look around today, do you not see similar patterns? Promising young men cut down before they can rise? Communities conditioned by fear, convinced their suffering is natural, their chains invisible? Do you not see institutions that preach obedience while quietly harvesting potential? The Murphy graves are not just history, they are prophecy, a warning in stone. And now you, hearing this, must ask yourself the question Dr. Caldwell asked in his final journal entry. If they could do this, then what makes you think they stopped? Now, listen closely, because this is where most people stop paying attention. Most stop at horror and call it story. But what you are hearing is instruction disguised as history. This is where the veil begins to lift. By the time the 6th Murphy son was born, Dr. Caldwell realized the full scale of the design. The deaths were not random acts of cruelty. They were deliberate extractions of potential. Every boy was groomed to inherit more than property. He was groomed to inherit knowledge, leadership, a chance to resist. And every time a Murphy son reached the threshold of 21, the system struck him down. It was, in every sense, a ritual of control. And yet, it wasn't enough for the architects of this plan to simply remove the boys. They needed the family and the town to internalize the lesson. That obedience was survival. That fate was fixed. That resistance was meaningless. And this is where you, listening now, become part of the story. There is a symbolic phrase, a key, a lock, and a mirror. If you understand even a fraction of what I have revealed, write it down twice in the comments below. Let it anchor the truth. Let it signal your awareness to the world and to yourself. Write, I see the pattern. I walk the path. Do it twice. Once for acknowledgement. Once for commitment. Because from this point forward, everything you hear will deepen the descent. The next Murphy sons, the mechanisms behind their deaths, the conspiracies that stretched beyond Millfield, all of it will challenge what you think you know about loyalty, faith, and freedom. And you cannot unhear it. Once the pattern is visible, ignorance is no longer an option. Once you acknowledge the ritual, you cannot return to naivety. That is the point. That is the danger. That is the power hidden in plain sight. The symbolic phrase you just wrote is more than words. It is your anchor to the path of awareness. It is a commitment to see the systems that manipulate, harvest, and consume the innocent systems hidden behind church walls, office doors, and family contracts. And the Murphys were their perfect blueprint. By the time the 6th and 7th Murphy sons were born, the pattern had become so precise it could be charted like a clock. Every birth, every milestone, every apprenticeship, every small act of independence was meticulously documented. The company knew what the boys were capable of, and more importantly, what they might one day attempt: rebellion, escape, or defiance. And they could not allow it. The 6th son, Seamus Jr., showed unusual intelligence for his age. He asked questions, analyzed ledgers, and even challenged authority in subtle ways. Caldwell noted his curiosity in private journals. He is exceptional and therefore dangerous to the design. Within weeks of turning 21, Seamus Jr. was found dead in his bedroom, officially labeled a sudden fever. Yet Caldwell's notes suggest he had been administered something, a compound, precise in dose, unseen by any observer, invisible to the doctor until it was too late. The 7th son, Thomas, was the culmination of the Murphy blueprint. Taller, stronger, sharper than any brother before him, he carried not only the family name but the cumulative knowledge of his lineage, the instincts, the courage, and the potential to resist the system. His death was, perhaps, the most orchestrated of all. On the morning of his 21st birthday, witnesses saw him walking calmly to the stream. He never returned. Hours later, his body was found downstream, face pale, hands clenched. A single rose laid upon his chest, a ritual touch by someone within the company. Someone aware that symbolism is as powerful as death itself. Dr. Caldwell, in his last journal entry, wrote, "The extraction is complete, the blueprint perfected, the Murphys are erased, their potential harvested, and yet, the system will continue, unbroken, elsewhere." You see, these deaths were never random. They were not punishment. They were method. Each son's removal refined the system, proving that human life could be scheduled, manipulated, and concluded without breaking the illusion of divine will. Obedience was reinforced. Fear was inherited. Silence became law. And the greatest horror? The Murphys never had the chance to question, resist, or even understand the full scope of what was happening to them. Their lives were a series of calculated inevitabilities, designed to reinforce a structure far larger than their family, far older than their village. When you look at these headstones today, remember this: the Murphys did not die because of chance. They were removed because someone, somewhere, understood the architecture of human potential and decided it must be harvested before it could ever escape control. The Pennsylvania State Archives hold over 300 pages on the Murphy family. Officially, they are sealed. Officially, they are inaccessible. But fragments of these documents, letters, court records, private diaries survived, and within them lies a story far darker than even the deaths themselves. One letter, written in 1878 by a Keystone supervisor to the company's board, reads like a ledger of lives rather than labor. Subject: Patrick Murphy line. Extraction schedule proceeding as predicted. Psychological conditioning confirmed. No deviation from projected outcomes. Recommend continuation with next subject. Note the cold precision.
No empathy.
No acknowledgement of the boys as human. They are subjects. Their lives measured against charts. Their deaths executed according to plan. Another document, Caldwell's own diary, describes correspondence he secretly received from an anonymous insider. It detailed experimental methods, compounds tested on food, the timing of exposure to stress, the manipulation of hope and expectation, all designed to break a young man's resistance at precisely 21. Caldwell writes, "The Murphys are models for a system that could govern entire populations. Obedience and submission are cultivated. Life is harvested. This is not superstition, it is science." Even more disturbing were the family letters that survived outside the archives. Margaret Murphy, writing to distant relatives in Ireland, hinted at her suspicions. "They come before my boys' birthdays. They speak kindly, but I know what they are doing, and no one in Millfield dares to stop them." Her words suggest an awareness that was both maternal and powerless. She knew her son's fates, yet she could not fight the invisible machinery surrounding them. And these records reveal a truth often overlooked. The Murphys were not alone. The company documented other families, other lines, other lives shaped to the same cruel rhythm. Millfield was merely the laboratory, the Murphys the proof of concept. When you read these documents, the fear they elicit is not just for history. It is for recognition, the recognition that structures of control can persist, unseen and unchallenged. That human potential can be measured, harvested, and erased under the guise of law, religion, or progress. Caldwell ended his final diary entry with a warning. "The stones are 7, but the experiment is infinite. When men learn to manipulate life as a formula, they are no longer mortal. And we, the witnesses, are already too late." This is the hidden architecture, the blueprint that made the Murphy tragedy inevitable. The tragedy of the Murphys was never just a family affair. It was a demonstration of systemic power, of a conspiracy that stretched its fingers into every corner of Millfield and beyond. To understand it, you must see how institutions collude. Keystone Coal controlled the town physically. Every home, every shop, every inch of land was leased, rented, or owned by the company. But control of bodies alone is not sufficient. To make obedience absolute, they enlisted the church. Father McKenna's sermons were never simply spiritual guidance, they were reinforcement of the company's agenda. Suffering is holy. Obedience is divine. Questioning authority is sin. With these words echoing through every pew, the townspeople internalized the narrative. Deaths were divine design, not human orchestration. Beyond the church, social structures enforced silence. Families reliant on Keystone for survival knew that speaking out meant eviction, starvation, or worse. Witnesses to unusual deaths were often intimidated, bribed, or quietly disappeared into the forests surrounding the town. Neighbors whispered, yes, but only when the doors were closed. In public, every tragedy was framed as fate, faith, or misfortune. And let's not underestimate the psychological architecture. Caldwell observed that every Murphy son was conditioned from birth through contracts, church attendance, and community ritual to accept the inevitability of their 21st year. Fear was inherited. Obedience became instinctive. Even if a Murphy boy suspected manipulation, he lacked the means, the allies, or the knowledge to resist. The conspiracy extended to record-keeping. Company ledgers, official death reports, and church registers were all coordinated to erase inconsistencies. A death could appear natural even if it was engineered. A disappearance could be labeled accident. A suspicious circumstance could be buried in a pile of bureaucratic paperwork that no outsider could penetrate. Dr. Caldwell saw it all. He recognized the invisible scaffolding of control. The corporate leases, the sermons, the social pressure, the surveillance, the records, the drugs, the compounds. Every element worked in concert, ensuring the Murphys never escaped the design. And here is the darkest truth. This level of collusion is not unique to Millfield, nor to the 1800s. Anywhere institutions align corporations, faith, social structures, the same architecture can be applied. Observation becomes manipulation. Life becomes data. Resistance becomes impossible. The Murphys were proof that when power is unified and disciplined, human life can be measured, controlled, and extinguished, all while the world believes it is merely fate. Now, pause for a moment and consider the full scope. 7 sons, each removed at the precise moment they could step into power. A mother haunted by visions. A father trapped in silent horror. A town complicit through fear. And all of it hidden beneath the comforting veil of routine, religion, and law. The Murphy story is not simply a tragedy. It is a demonstration of human potential harvested before it can escape control. It is a blueprint of obedience enforced across generations. And it is a warning. Systems that combine surveillance, ritual, and authority can bend even life itself to their will. Dr. Caldwell understood this before he died. He wrote, "We are witnesses to a machinery older than industry, more pervasive than any single institution. And it will not stop with the Murphys." His words echo because the machinery still exists, though its methods have evolved. Control no longer requires overt violence. It requires symbols, records, rituals, subtle levers that guide behavior, reward conformity, and quietly erase those who question. And what does this mean for you, sitting here now, listening? The lesson is brutal but simple. Vigilance is your only defense. Obedience is a trap. Rituals, contracts, belief systems, social pressures, all are tools for shaping behavior. If you cannot see them, you are already part of the experiment. If you do see them, your awareness becomes the first act of resistance. The Murphys are more than history. They are a mirror. Each headstone, each ledger, each hidden page whispers a warning. Power consolidated will harvest potential without remorse. Institutions can engineer fear, manipulate faith, and orchestrate death while the world sleeps. And once the system perfects itself, even those who try to intervene may be too late. You now stand at the threshold. You have seen the layers, traced the threads, and understood the design. The Murphys were removed at 21. Yes, but their lesson is eternal. A lesson in vigilance, awareness, and the dangerous knowledge that freedom is not granted. It is defended. Because those who understand the system are few. Those who act upon it are fewer still. And the machinery of control waits patiently for the unaware, the obedient, the complacent, all the while hiding in plain sight. Now you know the truth. The Murphy family did not die by accident, by curse, or by fate. They were removed, harvested, because their lives represented potential too dangerous to exist outside control. 7 sons, erased in sequence, each a demonstration of how obedience can be engineered, how human destiny can be calculated and concluded before it even begins. Think of the implications. If a family can be measured, conditioned, and terminated with such precision, what does that say about the structures around you today? The institutions you trust, the rituals you follow, the systems you obey, how many are quietly shaping, constraining, or even erasing human potential? The Murphys are proof that control can wear the mask of religion, law, labor, and civility all at once, and that even the cleverest, strongest, and most aware can be ensnared if the machinery is precise enough. Dr. Caldwell understood this before his death. He knew that once a system reaches the level of Millfield, once fear, ritual, and surveillance are aligned, the machinery becomes invisible. It is no longer just a company or a town or a priest. It is a living organism, one that harvests potential, enforces obedience, and perpetuates its design indefinitely. He warned that awareness alone is the first act of resistance, because once you see the pattern, you can no longer live as before. And this is where the lesson becomes personal. The Murphys were removed at 21, but their story speaks to every man who seeks knowledge, independence, and mastery. It asks, how much of your life is truly yours? How many of your choices are engineered by unseen forces? And when you see the machinery for what it is, will you bend to it or will you resist? Their graves are 7 stones in Pennsylvania, but their warning stretches far beyond. Vigilance is the weapon. Awareness is the shield. And courage is the only way to walk free. Remember this. Once you have seen the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Once you have felt the pull of control and traced the threads, the world of comforting ignorance no longer exists. You stand now at the edge of understanding, and what you do next will define whether you become another victim of the machinery, or one of the rare few who walk in truth, awake and aware. The Murphys' lives were stolen to teach us a lesson. Their deaths are not just history, they are a command. And now you carry that knowledge. Guard it. Question everything. Watch closely, because the machinery has not stopped. It only waits. If you could see the machinery behind one system in your own life, what would it be? Comment below and let's map it together. Right? I see the pattern. I walk the path. Twice in the comments if you've unlocked the truth today, join the circle of awareness. Most people live inside invisible cages they never notice. Watch closely. Question everything you've been told, starting with this story. If you recognize the pattern, don't keep it inside. Share one truth today you've uncovered in your own life and see who else is awake. For those ready to see the blueprints behind other hidden systems of power, subscribe and turn on notifications. I reveal things most historians and journalists will never touch.